At some point, actually having Fatou Bensouda and Hassan Jallow work for you in a project?
Well, way back, and I'm going back to 1981, and the day is burned into my mind because it was the 29th of July 1981, when there was a royal wedding in England, and the Queen's eldest son, Prince Charles, was getting married to his first wife. And then at such a wedding, all the leaders of the Commonwealth are of course invited, and the British Commonwealth, and of course one such country, a former British colony, was a country called the Gambia, which is a small country in the west coast of Africa. Now, the leader of that country was in London for this wedding, and as often happens, there was a coup d'etat, and it was a Marxist coup d'etat. And this was 1981, it was the height of the Cold War, of course, which most people have forgotten about these days. And the Gambia had a river which was, I think, 300 miles long and 100 miles deep water navigable. And the Marxists who took over that government invited the Russians in. And for 250 years, it was Russian foreign policy to look for what they called a warm water port. And so for the first time they were presented with this warm water port on a platter by this Marxist government that had taken over. This Marxist coup d'etat had led to this government that had taken over in the Gambia, and people started getting very twitchy, particularly on this side of the Atlantic. I mean, there were some congressmen talking about preemptive nuclear strikes against Russia because the Atlantic routes could have been cut and so on and so forth, and the Russians could have put several fleets, including nuclear fleets, into the Gambia. And so there was a serious problem that arose. But anyway, the long and the short of the story is that the coup d'etat was put down by troops that went in from Britain and other places, and in due course I got sent out by the Foreign Office in London to see what could be done in prosecuting those who were responsible for this coup d'etat, this Marxist coup d'etat. And when I arrived in the Gambia in 1981, about October 1981, I found 1,000 people in detention. And the only legislation that they had in the books was an English Treason Act of 1351, which they had inherited on independence. Now, this was an act, curiously, with which I had some familiarity, not because I was alive in 1351, but so simply because I had dealt with this act in other Commonwealth jurisdictions which had similarly inherited this piece of legislation. And so I went out and I decided that the only way in which the people who sought to overthrow the lawful government could be brought to justice for high treason was if the British government and the government of the Gambia agreed that all judges should come in from abroad and all prosecutors should come in from abroad. That was simply because it was a very small country and everybody had been touched by the coup d'etat and passions were running high. And so I found myself with Hassan Jallow, who I'm going to see later on today. He was a young man in the Attorney General's Department, and I was the Chief Special Prosecutor. And if I remember right, the current Chief Prosecutor of the ICC, she was my registrar.
Wow.
So we all worked together then, and this was the first internationalized court after Nuremberg in Tokyo. And people don't realize it and people don't know about it.
Yeah.
But it was set up in 1981 by myself and two of the people I've just mentioned, together with others. But I came to the conclusion that justice could only be seen to be done if, in fact, the prosecutors all came in from outside, and indeed the judges came in from outside. And that was what I did. I refused to conduct any prosecutions unless those terms were met. And so those terms were met, and if I remember right, I think 40 people were prosecuted. The only penalty under the 1351 Act was death. In those days, they didn't mess around, and so. But I think most of those most of those sentences were commuted. I mean, before I left, I wrote a letter to the president saying, you know, when you look down the trail of a nation's history, you see it lit with lanterns, and the lantern of humanity is the one that burns brightest. And if, in fact, you know, you want to keep the peace in your country, it may be a good idea to show mercy, and I think he did. But otherwise, they had been sentenced to death. But yes, Fatou Bensouda, who is the Chief Prosecutor of the ICC, together with Hassan Jallow, assisted me in creating and running this court, which till the courts were set up the ad hoc courts were set up in 1993 by the Security Council, ICTY, so on and so forth, was the first court after Nuremberg in Turkey to be set up in an internationalized fashion. And so I do know something about international justice and how it should be applied.